In the forgotten territories of 1883, some legends are born from the flash of a six-gun, others from the glint of gold. But the most powerful legends are often whispered, born from silence and survival. This is the story of Clara May Thompson, a woman who knew only the company of mountains and memories her world no bigger than the small valley she called home. She had been alone since a fire stole her world as a child, until the day the horizon darkened and 7 massive riders' men, carved from the very grit and granite of the West, rode into her life, not with guns drawn, but with the most terrifying proposition of all, a demand for her hand in marriage. What they really wanted, however, was a secret, buried deeper than any grave, a secret they would kill for. The silence of Whispering Creek Valley was a language Clara May Thompson understood better than any spoken word. It was a silence woven from the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk, and the steady rhythmic beat of her own heart. For 15 years since the fever took her parents and left her in the care of an old prospector named Silas Jones, this valley had been her entire world. After Silas passed 5 years back, the silence had grown deeper, but she had grown with it, becoming as resilient and unyielding as the ancient rock formations that guarded her homestead. Her cabin, built by Silas's gnarled hands, stood as a testament to fortitude. It was small but solid, its timber walls chinked tight against the winter wind, its stone chimney breathing a steady plume of gray smoke into the vast blue Arizona sky. Her life was a cycle of hard-won certainties, mending fences, tending her small herd of cattle, cleaning the Winchester rifle that was her only true companion, and reading the handful of worn books Silas had left behind. She was 22 years old, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and hands calloused from work, not from want. She was utterly, profoundly, and contentedly alone. The day the world broke open began like any other. The sun was a hot coin climbing the eastern peaks, and Clara was splitting firewood, the sharp thwack of her axe, the only punctuation in the valley's long, rambling sentence. Her horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dusty, nickered softly from the corral. It was a sound of peace. Then came another sound. It started as a low, guttural tremor, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the rhythmic thunder of many hooves moving with purpose. Strangers were a rarity here. A lone trapper might pass through once a season, or a lost soul might stumble upon the valley by mistake. But this was different. This was an arrival. Clara froze, her axe held aloft. Her gaze snapped to the mouth of the valley, the only passable entrance through the ring of jagged mountains. 7 riders. They moved not as a posse, which would be ragged and urgent, nor as cavalry, which would be ordered and uniform. They rode like a pack of wolves, a single organism of leather dust and menace. Even from a distance, their size was intimidating. They were giants, each man a mountain in the saddle. Her hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered on her hip. She finished her swing, sinking the axe into the chopping block, and moved with quiet urgency to the porch. She pulled the Winchester from its pegs beside the door, levered around into the chamber, with a practiced metallic schlick-schlack, and waited. They rode directly toward her cabin, their pace unhurried, arrogant. As they drew closer, their features sharpened from the dusty haze. The man in the lead was clean-shaven, with a cold, handsome face and eyes that seemed to appraise and possess everything they looked at. He wore a fine black coat, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of his companions. He was their clear leader. To his right rode a behemoth of a man with a wild red beard and fists like cured hams resting on his saddle horn. Beside him, a shockingly handsome man with blonde hair and a dazzling smile that didn't reach his eyes. The others were a grim collection of hard faces, scarred and sun-scorched, each carrying an arsenal of pistols and rifles. They were not drovers or ranchers. They were predators. They reined in their horses a respectful 30 yards from her porch, forming a silent, intimidating crescent. The dust settled around them. The valley's familiar silence returned, but now it was heavy, suffocating. The handsome leader dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. He took off his hat, revealing dark, impeccably combed hair. "Ma," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was utterly out of place in this wilderness. "Apologies for the intrusion. My name is Caleb Cole." Clara remained silent. The Winchester held loosely, but ready at her side. Her eyes flicked from Cole to the other 6 men, cataloguing threats, memorizing faces. Cole's smile was a placid, unnerving thing. "We've ridden a long way to find this place, and to find you, Miss Thompson." Her blood ran cold. He knew her name. Silas had always warned her. The value of this valley wasn't just in its water or its seclusion. It had a history, a secret. "State your business," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the alarm bells screaming in her head. "Our business," Cole said, taking a step forward, "is a delicate one, a proposition of a most personal nature." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension coil. His eyes met hers, and they were like chips of polished obsidian. "Miss Thompson, my companions and I have come to a collective decision. We have come to ask for your hand in marriage." The statement was so absurd, so utterly insane, that for a moment Clara thought she had misheard. The wind whistled through the eaves of the cabin. One of the horses stamped its foot. She stared at him, then let her gaze drift over the other 6. The red-bearded giant Bartholomew Bart Hogan grinned foolishly. The charmer Beau Garrett gave her a practiced wink. A gaunt, shadowy man with a preacher's collar, Josiah Pike, nodded solemnly. A wiry man with shifty eyes, Phineas Finn O'Malley, licked his lips like a coyote scenting blood. A quiet, deadly-looking man, Silas Kane, watched her with an unnerving stillness. And finally the youngest of them, a boy of no more than 19, with wide, uncertain eyes. Billy Younger looked down at his saddle horn, avoiding her gaze. "Is this some kind of joke?" Clara finally asked, her voice dangerously low. Caleb Cole's smile never faltered. "I assure you, it is the most serious offer you will ever receive. We understand this is unconventional, but the 7 of us are partners. We share everything. We've decided for legal and practical purposes that this land must be secured through a union. One of us will be your husband. The choice of which one—" He gestured magnanimously to his grim-faced companions. "We will leave to you." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a proposal. It was a threat wrapped in the trappings of civility. They weren't asking for her hand. They were claiming her and her land as their property. Clara's knuckles were white on the stock of her Winchester. She raised the barrel slightly until it was pointing at the center of Caleb Cole's chest. "I have your answer," she said, the calm of the valley returning to her voice. But now it was the calm of a coiled rattlesnake. "Get off my land. Now, or the only union you'll be having is with the dirt in my graveyard." Caleb Cole's smile finally vanished. His eyes hardened. He looked at the rifle, then back at her face, and for the first time he seemed to see the woman of iron behind the solitary facade. "A spirited woman," he said, softly, almost to himself. He put his hat back on his head. "We will not be leaving, Miss Thompson. We will make camp at the edge of the valley. We are patient men. We will give you time to consider our proposal and all its benefits. Choose wisely." He turned, swung back into his saddle with effortless grace, and led his 6 shadows away, their thundering hooves churning up the dust, leaving Clara May Thompson standing on her porch, her heart hammering against her ribs, no longer alone, but besieged. The silence that fell in their wake was no longer her companion. It was the sound of the world holding its breath. The 7 riders did not go far. Just as Caleb Cole had promised, they established a camp near the mouth of the valley, a semi-permanent stain on the pristine landscape. Their camp was a hive of quiet, disciplined activity. They were organized their picket line, for the horses neat their 2 large tents, pitched with an almost military precision. From her porch, Clara could see the flicker of their campfire at night, a malevolent orange eye staring at her through the darkness. It was a constant, unnerving reminder of their presence. The siege had begun. They called it a courting. Clara called it a slow-motion invasion. They began their campaign the very next day, each man employing a strategy that reflected his nature. It was a grotesque parody of traditional courtship, a series of calculated maneuvers designed to wear her down. Beau Garrett came first. He rode up in the late morning, leading a horse behind him. He was, Clara had to admit, almost painfully handsome. His blonde hair was golden in the sun, and his smile was a weapon he wielded with expert precision. He stopped at the same spot as before, a safe distance from her rifle. "Mornin', Miss Thompson," he called out, his voice as smooth as creek water. "Figured a lady like yourself might appreciate a finer ride than that dusty old buckskin." The horse he led was a magnificent black mare with a white star on its forehead. It was a steed worthy of a queen. Clara watched him from the porch, her Winchester resting in the crook of her arm. "My dusty suits me fine. Every woman deserves beauty." Beau insisted, his smile unwavering. "A beautiful horse for a beautiful woman. It's only right. The only thing I'd find beautiful right now, Mr. Garrett, is the sight of your back as you ride out of this valley." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "A woman of sharp wit. I admire that." He tied the mare's reins to her fence post. A gift. No strings attached. Something to think on. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving the exquisite animal to stand as a symbol of their wealth and presumption. The next day brought Bartholomew Bart Hogan. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He rode to her woodpile dismounted and began to split her remaining logs with a monstrous axe he'd brought with him. Each swing was a grunt of raw power, sending huge chunks of wood flying. He worked for an hour, sweat glistening on his bare, muscular arms, his red beard bristling with exertion. He was demonstrating his strength, his ability to provide and protect in the most primal way possible. When he was done, he stacked the wood in a perfect towering chord. He wiped his brow, looked at her cabin, gave a curt nod, and left without a word. The pile of wood was an offering and a threat. "This is the power I can use, for you or against you." Josiah Pike, the self-proclaimed preacher, took a different tack. He would stand at the edge of her property line, 100 yards away, and read from his worn leather Bible, his voice a droning monotone that carried on the wind. He spoke of lonely women in the scriptures, Ruth Esther, and their salvation through union with powerful men. He twisted sacred words into a tool of coercion, his piety a thin veil for the same avarice that drove the others. Phineas Finn O'Malley. The weasel tried subtlety. Clara would find things left near her property, a brace of rabbits cleaned and ready for the pot, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a new whetstone for her knives. They were gestures meant to seem thoughtful, but she knew he was using them as an excuse to scout her land, to probe her defenses, to learn the rhythms of her life. She left the gifts to rot where she found them. Silas Kane, the silent one, was perhaps the most unsettling. He did nothing. He would simply ride to a high ridge overlooking her cabin and sit on his horse for hours, motionless, just watching. He was a sentinel of intimidation, his quiet presence a constant reminder that she was being observed, that she had no privacy, no sanctuary left. Caleb Cole, the leader, stayed at their camp, orchestrating the psychological assault. But it was the seventh man, the boy Billy Younger, who was the most curious. He did nothing. He never approached her cabin, never made a gesture. Clara would sometimes see him from a distance, tending the horses or staring out into the vast emptiness of the valley, and his face held a conflict the others lacked. He seemed younger than his 19 years out of place among these hardened predators. There was a hesitancy in his posture, a shadow of doubt in his eyes that she could see even from afar. Days bled into a week. The pressure was immense. The valley, once her haven, now felt like a cage. Every creak of a floorboard, every snap of a twig in the woods sent her reaching for her rifle. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. She ate standing up, watching the windows. Her cherished solitude had been curdled into fearful isolation. She knew she couldn't hold out forever. Her supplies were finite. More importantly, she felt her resolve beginning to fray at the edges. They were patient. They had time. She was one woman against 7. It was during the second week that one of them finally made a mistake. Beau Garrett, overconfident in his charm, rode closer than usual. "Miss Thompson, Clara May," he called his voice, laced with feigned familiarity. "This standoff is foolish. We're offering you a partnership, protection, wealth beyond your wildest dreams. Old man Silas's legacy is worth more than you could ever imagine." The name hit her like a physical blow. Silas's legacy. The old prospector had been a simple man. He'd lived off the land, his only wealth, the stories he told, and the kindness in his heart. What legacy could Beau be talking about? Her mind raced. Silas had known this valley better than any living soul. He'd spent 30 years prospecting its creeks, mapping its caves, learning its secrets. He had always been secretive about one particular area, a series of old, collapsed tunnels in the northern canyon he called the Diablo's Maw. He'd warned her to stay away from it, saying the ground was unstable, cursed. A sudden chilling thought took root in her mind. Silas wasn't just a trapper, he was a prospector. What if he had found something valuable enough to bring 7 vultures circling his grave? Her expression must have changed, a flicker of understanding in her eyes, because Beau's confident smile tightened. He had said too much. "Just think on it. Clara May," he said quickly, his charm now sounding hollow. He wheeled his horse around and retreated a little too fast. The seed of suspicion had been planted. Her fear, cold and paralyzing, began to burn with a new heat anger. They weren't just after her land. They were after something specific, something Silas had hidden. And she realized with a terrifying clarity that they didn't just want a marriage certificate. They wanted a key, and they thought she was it. That night she didn't just watch the orange glow of their campfire. She stared into it, her mind working furiously. She was no longer just a woman defending her home. She was the guardian of a secret, Silas's secret, and she would die before she let them have it. The game had changed. She was no longer just surviving. She had to find out the truth. The fragile, unspoken truce shattered on a Tuesday. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a sheet of dull grey metal threatening a storm. The oppressive weather mirrored the mood in the valley, a tension that had been stretched to its breaking point. Bart Hogan had run out of patience. He was a man of action, of brute force, and simple desires, and the prolonged, delicate siege, orchestrated by Caleb Cole, grated on his primal instincts. He wanted the land, he wanted the secret it held, and he wanted the woman. He intended to take all three. Clara was in the barn, currying Dusty, when she heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. It was a sound too confident, too close. She peeked through a crack in the weathered planks. It was Bart marching directly toward her cabin, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't carrying a gift or posturing from a distance. He was coming for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low rumble of distant thunder. She grabbed her rifle, her movements swift and silent. She slipped out the back of the barn, circling around behind the small smokehouse, using the familiar terrain for cover. She watched as Bart reached the porch. He didn't knock. He simply put his massive shoulder to the door and shoved. The wood groaned, the latch splintering, and the door swung inward with a crash. He stepped inside, a giant silhouette filling the doorway of her small home. The violation of it, the raw audacity, sent a surge of pure, cold rage through her. This was her sanctuary, the only home she had ever known, and he had breached it as if it were nothing. She heard him rummaging inside, the sound of her few possessions being overturned, the clatter of a tin plate hitting the floor. He was looking for something, the legacy Beau had mentioned. "Come on out, girlie." His voice boomed from inside the cabin, a terrifying, muffled roar. "Stop this foolishness. I'm a better man than any you'll find. I'll keep you safe. Just show me what the old man left you." Clara crept to the corner of the smokehouse, resting the Winchester's barrel on the edge of the timber wall to steady her aim. Her breath was coming in short, sharp bursts, but her hands were rock steady. Silas had taught her to shoot, not just for hunting, but for this. Never shoot to kill unless you have to. His voice echoed in her memory. A wounded man is a lesson. A dead man is a war. Bart emerged from the cabin, his face red with frustration. He scanned the property, his eyes finally landing on the barn. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He thought she was hiding. He started walking toward it. "Here, kitty, kitty!" He taunted, his voice dripping with menace. Clara took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and lined up her shot. She wasn't aiming for his chest or his head. She aimed lower, at his leg. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester was deafening, a sharp, clean sound that ripped through the heavy air. It was followed almost instantly by Bart's bellow of pain and surprise. He stumbled, grabbing his thigh, as a dark stain of blood blossomed on his canvas trousers. He didn't fall, but he staggered back, his face a contortion of rage and agony. "Witch!" he roared, fumbling for the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw, Clara worked the lever action of the rifle, the empty cartridge ejecting with a metallic ping. She fired again. This time the bullet kicked up a spray of dirt a foot from his boots. It wasn't a miss, it was a statement. The next one won't be. The message was received. Bart Hogan, the brute. The unstoppable force looked from the hole in his leg to the silent smokehouse, where the puff of smoke had originated. For the first time, he looked afraid. He turned, limping heavily, and began to retreat, dragging his wounded leg behind him, cursing her name with every painful step. Clara stayed put, her rifle trained on his back, until he was halfway to his camp. Only then did she allow herself to slide down the wall of the smokehouse, her body trembling with the adrenaline crash. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. This was no longer a war of nerves. It was a war of survival. She had drawn first blood. The shot galvanized the outlaws' camp. She saw them swarm out, Beau and Finn, helping the wounded Bart, while Caleb Cole stared toward her cabin, his face unreadable from this distance. Even from 100 yards away, She could feel the intensity of his glare. The dynamic within the group had been fractured. Later that afternoon, the cracks began to show. Voices carried on the wind, loud and angry. Bart's roars of fury were punctuated by Caleb's sharp, cutting tones. "You fool, I told you to wait!" Caleb's voice sliced through the air. "She needs to be shown. A little force is what she understands," Bart bellowed back. "You've shown her nothing except that we can be wounded." Caleb retorted, his voice dangerously low. "You've proven she's not just a helpless girl with a rifle. She's a fighter. You've made this 10 times harder, you oaf." Clara listened, her ear pressed to the cabin wall she had hastily repaired. Bart's recklessness had not only earned him a bullet, but had also exposed a rift among her tormentors. Cole was the strategist patient and cunning. Bart was the muscle impulsive and violent. Their methods were in conflict. And in that conflict, Clara saw her first real glimmer of hope. They were not a monolith. They were 7 greedy men held together by a common goal, but each with his own ego, his own fears and his own breaking point. She had found Bart Hogan's. Now she had to find the others. The attempted assault and her violent response changed everything. The pretense of courting was over. The gifts stopped. The Bible readings ceased. The quiet watchfulness of Silas Kane intensified, now imbued with a deadly focus. The air in Whispering Creek Valley grew colder, heavier. The coming storm was no longer just in the sky. It was on the ground, and she was standing at its very center. The shooting of Bart Hogan brought Clara a fragile temporary peace. The men kept their distance, a new grudging respect mingling with their simmering animosity. But Clara knew this was merely the eye of the storm. Cole's anger wasn't just directed at Bart. It was directed at the situation, at the loss of control. He would be planning his next move, and it would be more calculated, more insidious than a frontal assault. Clara had to move faster. The name Silas had been spoken like a key, and she now believed the lock was hidden somewhere in his past. She couldn't stay besieged in her cabin, waiting for the next attack. She needed answers, and the only place to get them was outside the valley. She had to go to Redemption. Redemption was a 2-day ride away, a dusty speck of civilization that clung to the banks of the San Pedro River. It was the only town Silas had ever visited, making a trip twice a year for salt flour ammunition and news. Waiting for the outlaws to make a move was suicide. She had to take the initiative. Her plan was risky, bordering on foolish. She would have to slip past 7 pairs of watchful eyes. She waited 2 nights until the moon was a mere sliver in the sky, and the clouds from the aborted storm still hung low and thick, swallowing the starlight. She packed light jerky, a canteen, and extra cartridges. She didn't saddle Dusty. His familiar shape would be too easily recognized. Instead, she moved on foot, wearing dark clothing, the Winchester in her hand and the Colt on her hip. She left her cabin near midnight, a single lamp burning in the window, to give the impression she was still inside. She moved like a phantom through the land she knew intimately, her bare feet making no sound on the pine needles and soft earth. She skirted the outlaws' camp, staying deep in the timberline, her senses on fire. She could smell their wood smoke, hear the soft nicker of a restless horse, and the low murmur of the man on watch. She held her breath as she passed a ghost in her own home and slipped out of the valley's mouth into the open country beyond. The journey was grueling. She walked and jogged through the night, and by dawn she was miles away, a small figure in a vast, unforgiving landscape. She rested during the hottest part of the day in the shade of a rock outcropping before pressing on. Fear was a constant companion, the fear of being followed, but the need to know the truth was a sharper spur. She arrived on the outskirts of Redemption late the next afternoon, covered in dust and exhausted to the bone. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. It was a place where men came to spend their money and forget their sins. Clara's first stop was the office of the territorial assayer, a man named Bartholomew Higgins. He was a small, fussy man with a green eyeshade and ink-stained fingers, a man who dealt in facts and figures, not legends. Silas had trusted him. "Clara May Thompson," Higgins said, peering over his spectacles as she entered his cluttered office. "Good heavens, child, you look like you've wrestled a dust devil. It's been, 5 years since your Silas passed. I was sorry to hear it. He was a good man, an honest man." "Mr. Higgins," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "I need to ask you about him, about his claims. Was he working any?" Higgins frowned, leaning back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. Silas Jones. Now there was a character. He never filed a formal claim, not once in the 30 years I knew him, said the paperwork was a thieving government's way of putting its nose in an honest man's business. But he trailed off, tapping a finger on a dusty ledger. He did register assays, every year like clockwork, brought in samples to see what he was dealing with. He heaved the heavy ledger onto his desk and began flipping through the brittle yellowed pages, muttering to himself, "Jones, Jones, Jones. Ah, here we are." He ran a grimy finger down a column. "Mostly trace amounts. A little copper here, some low-grade silver ore there. Nothing to write home about. Nothing to... Oh my." Higgins stopped. He leaned in, closer, his eyes widening. He pushed his spectacles up his nose and read the entry again. Well, I'll be. I'd forgotten all about this. This was his very last entry, about a month before he passed. "What is it?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to pound. Higgins looked up at her, his expression one of awe. "Child, your Silas wasn't just chipping at rocks. This last sample, it was argentite, nearly pure silver sulfide, and the quartz it was in, riddled with native silver. I've only seen ore this rich a handful of times in my life. It comes from what the old Spanish miners called a bonanza vein, a heart of pure silver. He found it, Clara May. He really found it." The room seemed to tilt. "A heart of silver. The Corazon de Plata." Higgins whispered as if the words themselves were precious. "It's an old legend in these parts. A lost Spanish mine said to be so rich the walls themselves wept silver tears. Most folks dismissed it as a campfire story. But Silas, that stubborn old coot, found it." He showed her the ledger. The entry was clear, the numbers stark. The potential value was staggering enough to make kings out of paupers and killers out of honest men. "He never told me," Clara whispered, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "Perhaps he was trying to protect you," Higgins said gently. "A find like this isn't a blessing, child. It's a curse. It draws the worst kind of men like flies to a corpse, men who would do anything to possess it." Suddenly, the 7 massive riders, their arrogant proposal, their relentless pressure, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They knew. Someone else must have known about Silas's final assay. Maybe a clerk in the office had talked. Maybe they'd found one of Silas's maps. It didn't matter how. They knew her valley held a fortune, and they saw her not as a woman to be won, but as the last inconvenient obstacle to that fortune. The marriage proposal wasn't a strange courtship. It was their attempt at a legal claim, a way to own the land and its treasure through her before simply disposing of her. Her exhaustion vanished, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp focus. She thanked Mr. Higgins, her mind a whirlwind of new information. She now knew the what. She still needed to figure out the how. How had they found out? And what was their ultimate plan? Her quest for answers wasn't over. She had one more stop to make. In Silas's old belongings, stored in the back of the general store, he kept a small locked chest. He had always called it his box of memories. She now suspected it held something far more valuable. She had the key on a leather thong around her neck. She had to get to that chest before she returned to the valley. She had to find Silas's map. The general store in Redemption was run by a kind elderly woman named Martha Gable, whose late husband had been Silas's closest friend. She greeted Clara with a warm, wrinkled smile and a hug that smelled of cinnamon and flour. "Clara May, it does my heart good to see you," she said, her eyes full of concern. "But you look like you've seen a ghost. I'm chasing one." I think Clara replied the words truer than Martha could know. She explained that she needed to retrieve Silas's old chest from the store's back room. Martha, ever trusting, led her through a curtained doorway into a cluttered storeroom filled with barrels, crates, and the accumulated memories of a frontier town. In a dusty corner sat the small iron-banded chest Clara remembered from her childhood. With trembling fingers, she slid the old worn key from around her neck and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a rusty groan. She lifted the lid. The chest was filled with the mundane treasures of a lonely man's life, a faded tintype of her parents, a pouch of useless but pretty stones, his worn-out whittling knife, and a bundle of letters from his brother back east tied with twine. But beneath it all, tucked into a false bottom Clara had never known existed, was a slim journal bound in oilcloth and a folded, brittle piece of canvas. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. She opened the journal first. Silas's handwriting was a rough, spiky scrawl, but his words were clear. The last few entries, dated in the weeks before his death, told the whole story. October 12th. Followed the old Apache trail up past the Diablo's Moor. Noticed a discoloration in the rock, the kind my father always told me to look for. Something feels different about this place. October 19th. It's real. All the stories, all the legends. It's all real. I broke through a rock fall at the back of the collapsed tunnel. The air was stale, like it hadn't been breathed in a century. And the walls, dear God, the walls glitter in the lantern light. Veins of pure silver thick as my arm. The Corazon de Plata. I have found it. October 25th. Road to Redemption. Higgins confirmed it. Richest ore he's ever seen. The fool wanted to shout it from the rooftops. I swore him to secrecy, but a secret this big is a heavy stone to keep in your pocket. I fear it might fall out. November 2nd. I cannot file a claim. It would bring a rush. It would destroy the valley. It would destroy Clara's peace. This treasure is her inheritance, but it is also her poison. I must keep it hidden. For her. November 5th. A new man in town. Calls himself Caleb Cole. Asked too many questions at the saloon. Smooth talker, but his eyes are like a snake's. He watched me talking to Higgins. I have a bad feeling. I must hide the map well. If anything happens to me, only Clara will know where to look. Clara's blood turned to ice. Caleb Cole. He had been there. He had seen Silas. He had likely suspected something then, and had spent the last 5 years putting the pieces together, hunting for the prize. With shaking hands, she unfolded the canvas. It was a hand-drawn map of Whispering Creek Valley, rendered in meticulous detail by a man who knew every rock and tree. And there in the northern canyon, marked with a small faded X in charcoal, was the entrance to the Diablo's Moor. Below it, Silas had sketched the interior tunnels, noting weak spots, fault lines, and the location of the main chamber, the Corazon de Plata. It was a blueprint to a fortune. It was also a blueprint for a death trap. She had what she needed. The truth was colder and more terrifying than she had imagined. The marriage proposal was a sham, a clever legal maneuver. Their plan was to marry her, force her to reveal the mine's location, and then undoubtedly arrange for the new bride to have a fatal accident. She would disappear, and her grieving husband would be the sole legal owner of the richest silver strike in the Arizona Territory. A new strength forged from rage and grief solidified within her. They had underestimated her. They saw a lonely girl an obstacle. They didn't see Silas's true legacy, not the silver but his student. He had taught her more than how to shoot and track. He had taught her how to think, how to survive, and how to use the valley itself as a weapon. As she prepared to leave Redemption, a new figure entered the general store. It was Billy Younger. Clara froze her hand, instinctively dropping to her Colt. He saw her and stopped dead, his young face pale with shock. His eyes darted around the store before landing back on her. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "Miss Thompson," he whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. I had a feeling you'd come here. I rode out last night. They don't know I'm gone." "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice low and suspicious. "To warn you," he said, his voice cracking with sincerity. "Caleb, he's done waiting. After you shot Bart, he changed the plan. He's not talking about marriage anymore. He's talking about how to get the map. He thinks you have it, or that you know where it is. They're planning to storm your cabin. Tonight or tomorrow. They won't be gentle this time." Clara studied his face, searching for deceit. All she saw was genuine fear, not for himself, but for her. He was just a boy caught up with monsters, a flicker of conscience in a sea of greed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Billy looked down at his scuffed boots. "When I signed on with Cole, it was for adventure, for money. I never signed on to what this has become. My pa was a decent man. He'd be ashamed of me. What you did to Bart, you were defending your home. You're brave, braver than any of them. This ain't right." An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in Clara's mind. She couldn't fight 6 men alone. But maybe she didn't have to. "You want to make things right, Billy?" she asked, her voice quiet but intense. He looked up, his eyes wide. "Yes, Mum, I do." "Then you're going to help me," she said, her gaze as hard as steel. "You're going to ride back to that camp, and you're going to be Caleb Cole's most loyal man. You'll be my eyes and my ears, and when the time is right, you're going to help me lead them into a trap they'll never walk out of." Billy Younger stared at her, at this woman who had seemed so small and solitary on her porch, and he saw the iron will that had kept her alive. He saw the mind of a general planning a battle. He swallowed hard, the last vestiges of his boyhood falling away. "Yes, Ma'am," he said, his voice no longer cracking. "I will." An unlikely and perilous alliance was forged in the dusty storeroom of the Redemption General Store. Clara now had the truth, the map, and an inside man. The odds were still impossible, but they were no longer 0. She was no longer just defending. She was hunting. Clara and Billy parted outside Redemption, their dangerous alliance sealed. Billy rode hard, reaching the outlaws' camp to find an atmosphere thick with violence. Bart Hogan nursed his wounded leg and a burning grudge, while Caleb Cole's patience had worn paper-thin. Billy, his heart pounding, played his role perfectly. He claimed his horse had thrown a shoe, forcing him into town, where he'd overheard the local assayer deep in his whiskey, rambling about the legendary Corazon de Plata, a lost silver mine Silas Jones was rumored to have found. The name was the spark that ignited Cole's explosive greed. The vague prize now had a legendary title, making it feel real and within his grasp. All subtlety vanished. He was done waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The next morning the men were stunned to see a lone figure walking from the cabin toward them, a piece of white cloth tied to a stick held high. It was Clara. They surrounded her instantly, a pack of wolves cornering their prey. Cole dismounted, a triumphant smirk gracing his lips. "Have you come to your senses, Miss Thompson?" he asked. Clara held her head high, her face a carefully constructed mask of weary resignation. "I have," she said, her voice sounding defeated. "You've won. I can't live like this. I will accept your proposal." A murmur of surprise rippled through the men. Cole's eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. It seemed too easy. "And your terms?" "I will choose my husband," Clara stated, her gaze sweeping over the grim faces before shockingly settling on Billy Younger. "I'll marry the boy," Bart Hogan scoffed. "Him why the whelp?" Clara's answer was a stroke of genius designed to play on their arrogance. "Because he's young," she said, glancing at Billy with feigned contempt. "He seems the most manageable of the lot. He'll do what he's told, unlike a man full of his own ideas." The insult worked perfectly. The older men saw Billy as a weak pawn she foolishly thought she could control. Caleb Cole smiled, believing he understood her pathetic strategy. "A wise choice," he conceded, "but the marriage is only half the bargain. We get a wedding gift, the location of the mine." "Of course," Clara said with a sigh. "Silas told me where it was. The entrance is in the Diablo's Maw, a dangerous canyon. The ground is unstable." She then laid the final piece of her trap. "The ceremony can take place there, at the mouth of the mine, a new beginning, at the source of our new prosperity. We will all go together tomorrow at sunrise. I will show you the entrance, and then your preacher can say the words." The sheer poetic justice of the idea appealed to Caleb's vanity. To claim the bride and the treasure in a single masterful stroke was a conclusion worthy of him. Blinded by the promise of silver, he saw only her complete and total surrender. That night, the outlaws' camp was filled with celebration. They drank whiskey and boasted of the riches that would soon be theirs. Billy Younger sat among them, forcing himself to laugh at their jokes, his stomach churning with fear. He was their Judas goat, leading them to slaughter. Meanwhile, in the hills above, Clara was not celebrating. She was preparing for war. She cleaned her Winchester until it gleamed, laid out her cartridges, and mentally walked through every inch of the Diablo's Maw. She had tossed Silas's canvas map into her fire. She didn't need it anymore. The valley was her weapon, and the map was etched into her mind. Tomorrow she would give the 7 riders their wedding, and she would give them their funeral. Dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in bloody shades of crimson and orange. The air was still and cold, holding its breath before the coming storm. Clara, dressed in practical buckskins, mounted her horse and led the procession of 7 riders toward the northern canyon. They rode with the swagger of conquerors, their faces alight with greed, entirely oblivious that they were being led to their own graves. Billy Younger rode among them, his face a mask of nervous tension that the others mistook for wedding day jitters. They entered the winding, narrow throat of the Diablo's Maw. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth on either side, casting long, dark shadows. The temperature dropped. Here the world belonged to Clara. She knew every rock, every ledge, every whisper of the wind. She led them deep inside to a wide, flat area dominated by a massive rock fall, the collapsed entrance to the old tunnels. "This is it," she announced, dismounting. Silas found a way through the back, up high. She pointed to a treacherous-looking goat path that snaked its way up the sheer canyon wall. "It leads to a fissure that drops down behind the slide. We go on foot from here." Her strategy was to divide and conquer. Finn barked bow. Caleb commanded, his eyes fixed on the rock fall. "Go with her. Billy, you too. The rest of us will cover you." Clara started up the path, her boots sure on the loose scree. The wiry Finn O'Malley followed close behind, with Beau Garrett next. Billy took his place behind them, his heart hammering, leaving the massive Bart Hogan to bring up the rear. His progress slowed by his wounded leg. 30 feet up at a point, marked by a precariously balanced boulder, Clara enacted the first phase of her plan. She pretended to stumble, sending a shower of pebbles down the path. As the men's attention was drawn to her, Billy took his cue. He feigned his own loss of balance, lurching backward into Bart. The big man, already unsteady, roared in surprise as he was knocked off balance. He pinwheeled his massive arms, but his weight and bad leg betrayed him. With a final desperate cry, he toppled from the path, his body hitting the rocks below with a sickening final crunch. "It's a trap," Finn shrieked, fumbling for his pistol as he realized their folly. But he was too late. In that moment of chaos, Clara had scrambled to a spot where she'd stashed a heavy axe. With a guttural cry, she swung it not at the men, but at the base of the balanced boulder above them. The rock shuddered, and then gave way, unleashing a targeted avalanche of stone and debris. The wall of gravel slammed into Finn and Beau, sweeping them from the narrow ledge. Their screams were sharp, then abruptly silenced. Below, Caleb Cole's face twisted from disbelief to pure fury. "Kill her!" he roared, raising his rifle. But Clara was already a ghost, scrambling up the rest of the path as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. She reached her destination, a sniper's nest she and Silas had used for hunting a perfect vantage point with ample cover. As planned, Billy opened fire from his position, not aiming to kill, but to sow confusion, forcing Caleb Josiah and the deadly Silas Kane to dive for cover. The canyon erupted into a full-scale gun battle, but it was not a battle of equals. It was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Clara's shots echoed from the canyon walls, making her position impossible to pinpoint. She was a phantom, her rifle speaking with deadly authority. Josiah Pike, the hypocritical preacher, made the fatal mistake of trying to flank her. He broke cover, clutching his Bible as he ran for a new position. A single clean shot from Clara's Winchester struck him square in the chest. He fell without a sound, his false piety ending in the Arizona dust. Only two remained: the mastermind, Caleb Cole, and the silent gunslinger, Silas Kane. Kane was the true threat. He moved with a predator's grace, blending with the shadows, his shots dangerously precise. He was methodically working his way up the canyon, closing the distance. Clara knew she couldn't win a straight duel with Kane. She had to change the battlefield. Billy the East Ridge. Now she screamed the signal they had arranged. Billy broke cover and scrambled away, drawing Kane's fire for a precious few seconds. It was the opening Clara needed. She abandoned her perch and sprinted for the dark fissure that led into the mine itself. Kane saw her move and gave chase with Cole, desperate not to lose his prize, following close behind. They plunged into the darkness after her leaving the bright, sunlit world for the suffocating black of the earth. The mine was a labyrinth, but for Clara it was a roadmap etched into her memory. She led them deeper into a section Silas had marked as dangerously unstable. She emerged into a large cavern. In the faint light filtering from above, the walls shimmered with an impossible ethereal glow. Veins of pure silver, thick as a man's arm, crisscrossed the rock like frozen lightning. It was the Corazon de Plata. For a moment, Caleb Cole was paralyzed by its beauty, his greed fulfilled at last. "It's real," he breathed. That moment of awe was his last. Silas Kane was not distracted. His pistol was raised, his cold eyes scanning the shadows. From the far side of the cavern, hidden in darkness, Clara raised her Colt. She ignored the men and aimed at the ceiling at a massive, fractured rock formation held in place by a single, fragile-looking stone pillar, the structural weakness Silas had noted in his journal. She emptied her pistol into the pillar's base. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone. With a deep, grinding groan that shook the very mountain, the ceiling began to give way. Kane looked up his face, showing his first and last expression of raw fear. He tried to run, but it was too late. With a deafening roar, tons of rock collapsed, burying the entrance, burying the silver, and burying the last of the men who had come to steal her life. The heart of silver was now their tomb. Clara was thrown by the concussion, the air sucked from her lungs. Then silence. Deep, profound, and final. She made her way through the dust-choked darkness to a secondary air shaft, clawing her way back to the surface. She emerged into the blinding sunlight, gasping for air, a creature reborn from the earth. Below, Billy Younger was waiting with the horses. He saw her, and a look of profound relief washed over his face. The 7 shadows were gone. The valley was silent once more, no longer the silence of loneliness, but the sacred silence of peace. Clara May Thompson stood with Billy Younger, looking over the valley that was now truly hers. The bodies were buried, the outlaws' camp was dismantled, and the entrance to the Corazon de Plata was sealed forever by the hand of justice. The silver, the curse that had drawn so much darkness, would remain in the heart of the mountain, a silent testament to the greed of men and the strength of one woman. Clara was no longer alone. She had found an ally in the most unlikely of places, a partner forged in fire and loyalty, not coercion. They would face the future together, on their own terms, building a life not on a treasure of silver, but on the more valuable foundation of respect and shared survival. Her story became a whisper in the territories, a legend of the lone woman who faced down 7 devils and won a reminder that the fiercest spirit in the West wasn't always the one with the quickest draw, but the one with the most to protect. What do you think makes a person truly strong? Is it solitude, or is it the alliances we choose to forge? The story of Clara May reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we defend, not the ones we dig up. If you were captivated by her fight for freedom, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story of true grit. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next tale from the untold history of the American West.